It was my first day working as a night security guard in a large public park, and I was eager to do a good job. The park was famous for its tranquility, a place where people came to relax, even at night. I was introduced to the routines, the areas I was supposed to patrol, and given clear instructions on how to proceed in case of incidents. Although everything seemed simple, I couldn't help but notice the cautious looks from the other guards when they mentioned certain local legends. As I walked through the park, the sky darkened, and the atmosphere around me began to change. The shadows lengthened, and the night's silence became increasingly present. It was a cold, foggy night, the kind of weather that made people retreat to their homes, leaving the park empty. The vastness of the place, combined with the stories I'd heard, made me a little uneasy, but I forced myself to ignore any feelings of fear. After all, it was just my first shift, and all I needed to do was complete my final round. As the hours passed, the fog thickened, making visibility limited. The park, which had once seemed welcoming, now turned into a labyrinth of shadows and silence. My footsteps echoed along the path, and all I wanted was to finish the round and return to the security post to end the shift. However, as I approached the more isolated areas of the park, the feeling of being watched started to grow inside me without a clear explanation for it. I tried to focus on my task, keeping my mind on the job and ignoring the unsettling thoughts that arose. With every step I took, it felt like something around me was changing, something I couldn't see but could sense. I knew I shouldn't give importance to these feelings, which were probably a result of my fatigue and the somber atmosphere of the night. Even so, the idea that something was wrong wouldn't leave me at peace. Finally, I reached the farthest part of the park, where there was a small lake. The water was still, reflecting the dense mist that hung over the place. I looked around, hoping to complete the round without further incidents, but a sense of unease told me that something was about to happen. With my heart beating a little faster, I prepared to move on, hoping that the feeling was just a product of my imagination. As I walked along the trail that circled the lake, the fog around me seemed to close in more and more, making it difficult to see a few meters ahead. The cold penetrated my skin, and the silent night began to weigh on my shoulders. Suddenly, I heard a sound behind me, something that made me stop immediately. It was footsteps, light but clearly noticeable, as if someone was following me. I quickly turned around, but saw nothing but dense fog and the shadows of the trees. For a moment I stood still, trying to hear again, but all I could hear was the muffled sound of the wind blowing through the trees. I tried to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but the discomfort didn't go away. I took a deep breath and continued walking, trying to ignore the growing fear. However, the footsteps returned, now closer, and my heart began to beat faster. Once again I stopped and looked around, hoping to see something or someone. But the thick fog seemed to swallow everything, making it impossible to distinguish any figure or movement. The feeling of being watched intensified, as if invisible eyes were watching me from all sides. I couldn't see anything, but I knew there was something there, something that was accompanying me in the darkness. Despite the fear, I tried to stay calm and continued my round. With each step, the sound of the footsteps seemed to get closer, almost echoing my own. The idea that I wasn't alone disturbed me deeply, but I couldn't let panic take over. I was the security guard, and it was my duty to keep my composure, even if something strange was happening. I tried to focus on the job, on the task of patrolling the park and ensuring that everything was in order, but the feeling that something was very wrong wouldn't leave me at peace. Finally, I decided that the best way to deal with it was to complete the round as quickly as possible and return to the security post. I knew something wasn't right, but I preferred to believe that I was overreacting. However, as I approached the most isolated area of the park, the feeling of danger became almost unbearable. I knew I couldn't simply ignore what I was feeling, but I needed to move forward, even if the fear began to take hold of me. As I advanced along the trail, my attention was entirely focused on the sounds around me. The silence of the park, which had once been reassuring, now seemed threatening, as if it was hiding something I couldn't see. As I walked, the fog around me grew thicker, creating distorted shapes that moved in my peripheral vision. My heart was pounding, and my instinct told me that something was very wrong. Then, as I looked across the lake, I saw a hooded figure standing still. The figure was positioned in such a way that I could only see its dark outline against the fog, but it was clear that it was watching me. My blood instantly ran cold, and I stood still, trying to understand what I was seeing. Who could that person be? Another security guard? A lost visitor? Or something more sinister? I tried to stay calm, telling myself that it could just be someone looking for something or someone, maybe another park employee. But the figure's immobile posture, combined with the darkness and fog, filled me with an irrational fear. I couldn't see its face, nor any detail that could indicate who or what it was, but the presence of that figure felt wrong, as if it didn't belong in that place. As I stared at the figure, waiting for it to make a move, my mind was in turmoil. Should I approach? Call for help? Or just ignore it and continue my round? But something inside me knew that I couldn't just let it go. I needed to know what or who that figure was. I needed to confront it, even if it meant facing something unknown. I decided that the only way to end that feeling of fear was to confront the hooded figure. With slow and cautious steps, I began to walk towards it. Each step felt heavier, and the tension grew with each moment. I didn't know what to expect, but I knew I needed to find out the truth, even if fear told me to do otherwise. The figure remained still, watching me as I got closer and closer. As I approached the figure, my breathing became increasingly difficult to control. The silence around me was oppressive, and the fog seemed to close in on both of us, isolating us from the rest of the world. The hooded figure remained motionless, like a dark statue by the lake. My heart was beating so hard that I could hear it in my ears, but I kept moving forward, determined to discover who or what was in front of me. When I finally got close enough to see more details, I realized that the figure didn't move an inch. It just continued to watch me, without any sign of emotion or reaction. A chill ran down my spine, but I couldn't back down now. I called out to it, trying to get a response, but the figure remained silent, as if my words couldn't reach it. The unease inside me grew with each second. The dread I felt at that moment was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It was a deep, visceral fear that told me to run, but something kept me rooted there. I decided that I needed to see the figure's face, to know who was watching me. With trembling hands, I took another step, reaching out to try to touch the hood covering its head. But before I could do anything, the figure vanished. The figure dissipated into the fog as if it had never been there. I stood there stunned, not knowing if what I had seen was real or just an illusion created by the mist and my fear. The spot where it had been standing moments before was now empty, and the fog around me seemed even denser, as if it was trying to hide something from me. I looked around, trying to find any sign of the figure, but there was nothing but darkness and silence. Panic began to take hold of me, and the only thing I could think of was getting out of there as quickly as possible. The park, which I knew well, now seemed like a strange and hostile place, full of invisible dangers. I knew I needed to get back to the security post, but fear told me that something was following me, something I couldn't see. With my heart racing, I started running back, trying to leave behind whatever that was. As soon as I started running, the fog seemed to become even thicker, enveloping me in almost total darkness. The path I knew so well now seemed strange and distorted, as if the park was turning into a maze with no way out. Panic was driving me, and I ran as fast as I could, without looking back, fearing that something was following me. The feeling of being chased was overwhelming. As I ran, the fog around me seemed to take on a life of its own, forming shadows that moved in my peripheral vision. With each step, the whispers began to emerge, first low and indistinct, but soon they became clearer and more disturbing. Soft, almost childish laughter echoed in the air, mingling with the whispers, creating an atmosphere of complete terror. I knew I wasn't alone, but whatever was with me wasn't something I could confront. The feeling of panic grew with every second, and I tried to focus on finding my way back to the security post. However, the fog made it impossible to see where I was going, and soon I realized I was completely disoriented. I couldn't recognize the usual landmarks in the park, and every path I took seemed to lead me further into the mist. The thought of being lost in that darkness heightened my despair, As I continued running, the whispers and laughter seemed to come from all directions, surrounding me and leaving me with no escape. I knew I needed to stay calm, but the fear of being hunted was unbearable. My breathing was out of control, and my lungs burned with the effort. Every step I took seemed to take me further from my destination, and the feeling that I would never escape that nightmare began to set in. Desperate, I kept running, aimlessly, just trying to escape the disturbing sounds echoing around me. I knew that if I stopped, whatever was chasing me would catch up to me. But the more I ran, the more I seemed to get lost in the fog. It was as if the park was trapping me, pulling me into a place where I would never be found. The only thing I could do was keep going, hoping to find a way out before it was too late. My desperate run through the fog left me increasingly disoriented. The park, which had once been a familiar place, now felt like unknown territory, full of hidden dangers. Every time I tried to get my bearings, the fog distorted my perception, making me lose my way. The trees around me seemed to move, creating new trails that led nowhere. The feeling of being trapped in a maze grew with each step. The panic inside me was at its peak, but I knew I had to try to calm down. I stopped for a moment, trying to catch my breath and think of a way out of the situation. The whispers and laughter continued, but I tried to ignore them, focusing only on remembering the paths I had taken so many times during the day. However, every time I tried to concentrate, the disturbing sounds seemed to intensify, undermining my ability to think clearly. The feeling of being pursued continued to torment me. Even without seeing anything, I knew I wasn't alone. The fear of being caught by something invisible was paralyzing, but I needed to keep moving. I knew that if I stayed still for too long, it could be the end for me. But every time I tried to find my way, the park seemed to change, as if it was playing with me, pulling me even further from the exit. As I tried to find a path, I began to question my own sanity. Was all of this real? Was I simply hallucinating? A victim of exhaustion and tension? The idea that my mind was betraying me was terrifying, but I couldn't shake the thoughts. Every shadow in the fog, every sound around me, seemed to confirm that I was losing control of reality. Finally, I decided that I needed to stop running aimlessly and try to pull myself together. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my heart and focus on a plan. The only way out of there would be to remember the paths I had walked during the day and follow them, ignoring the distortions of the fog. I couldn't allow fear to take over, even if everything around me was trying to drive me to despair. With a slightly clearer mind, I began to walk, determined to find my way back to the security post. After regaining some of my composure, I started walking again, focused on finding my way back to the security post. The fog remained dense, but I tried to ignore the disturbing sounds and concentrate on what I knew about the park. Each step was a struggle against fear, but the thought of finally escaping that nightmare gave me the strength to keep going. I passed several trails, trying to recognize landmarks, but everything seemed different in the darkness. As I walked, I began to hear something in the distance. It wasn't a whisper or a laugh, but a constant low sound, like the hum of electricity. My heart quickened with the hope that I was finally close to the security post. I followed the sound, quickening my pace, expecting to see the post's lights appear at any moment. Every passing second increased my anxiety, but also my determination to reach my destination. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, I saw a faint light through the fog. It was the security post, and the sight of it filled me with such relief that I nearly fell to my knees. The feeling of being close to safety gave me a new burst of energy, and I started walking faster towards the light. With each step, the post became clearer, and the hope that I was finally safe grew within me. When I reached the post, however, something was wrong. All the lights were off, except for a faint emergency lamp that flickered intermittently. The darkness inside the post was complete, and the sense of security I had hoped to find there evaporated instantly. The building, which should have been lit up and full of life, now seemed like an abandoned and sinister place, as if it had been left in a hurry. With my heart racing again, I entered the post, expecting to find someone who could help me. But instead, I found the place completely empty. The silence inside the post was even more oppressive than that of the park, and the only thing I could hear was the sound of my own breathing. The feeling that something was very wrong returned with full force, and I realized that my struggle was not yet over. Something was happening, something I couldn't understand. As I entered the post, the darkness seemed to swallow everything around me, and the fear returned with full force. The only light left was the faint emergency lamp, casting long and distorted shadows on the walls. I tried to turn on the main lights, but nothing happened. The switch didn't respond, and the feeling of being completely isolated began to overwhelm me. I looked around, searching for any sign of life, but the post was completely empty. The radio, my only connection to the outside world, was off the air. I tried to adjust the frequencies, but all I got was static in response. Desperation began to take hold of me, and the thought of being trapped in that park, with no communication, terrified me. The security post, which should have been my refuge, now felt like an abandoned and hostile place. Every dark corner seemed to hide something, and I no longer knew what was real and what wasn't. As I tried to find some explanation for what was happening, the whispers and laughter returned, now closer than ever. The sound seemed to come from within the post itself, echoing through the walls and leaving me completely paralyzed with fear. I knew I wasn't alone, but I couldn't see what was with me. The idea of being surrounded by something invisible and malevolent made me tremble, and the feeling that I was losing my sanity grew with every second. Panic drove me to run through the post, trying to find an exit or somewhere to hide, but there was nowhere to go. The doors seemed locked, and the windows showed only the darkness of the night outside. The feeling of claustrophobia increased, and the idea of being trapped in that place suffocated me. I no longer knew if what I was experiencing was real or just a nightmare from which I couldn't wake up. The exhaustion, tension, and fear kept building up until my body and mind simply gave out. At some point, I collapsed on the floor of the post, exhausted and unable to continue fighting against something I couldn't understand. The darkness around me seemed to envelop everything, and without realizing it, I lost consciousness, as if my body had decided that this was the only way to escape it all. When morning finally came, I was found on the floor of the security post, curled up in a corner, completely exhausted. The first rays of sunlight broke through the fog, dissipating the darkness that seemed to have imprisoned me for an eternity. The colleagues who arrived for the morning shift woke me up, and the concern on their faces was evident. I could barely speak, my mind still trapped in the horrors of the previous night. As daylight bathed the park, everything seemed to return to normal. The lights in the post were working again, the radio emitted clear signals, and the place, which hours before had seemed like an abandoned and hostile site, was now just a simple office. My colleagues asked what had happened, but I couldn't find the words to describe what I had experienced. The only thing I knew for sure was that I couldn't stay there. I contacted the company and resigned that same day. I wasn't prepared for that kind of work. Something inside me told me I would never be able to return to that park without reliving the terror I felt. Every shadow, every whisper, would be etched in my mind forever. The memories of that night were fragmented, as if parts of it had been ripped from my memory. But the fear was real, and that was enough to keep me away. Even after leaving the job, the questions continued to haunt me. I never found out what really happened that night. Was it all a product of my imagination, a hallucination caused by fatigue and the fear of the legends surrounding the park? Or was there something more, something that was there, watching, waiting, feeding off the fear of those who dared to get close? These questions were never answered, and perhaps they never will be. Today, when I pass by the park, I avoid looking in its direction. The tranquility it offers during the day hides what I know lurks in the shadows at night. And although I have tried to move on, the memories of that last round stay with me, a constant reminder that some things cannot be explained, only feared. My first day as a nurse at the old hospital started quietly, but there was a tension in the air that I couldn't explain. The hospital, though still partially operational, seemed like a relic from the past. The corridors were dimly lit, the walls covered with a light layer of dust, and the silence was so deep that I could hear my own footsteps echoing as I walked. Even though I was excited about the new job, an unsettling feeling told me that this night would mark my life in a way I could never have imagined. When I arrived, I was greeted by some of the more senior nurses who showed me the active ward where I would spend most of my shift. They were kind, but there was a certain distance in their words, as if they were used to seeing new nurses come and go. During the brief orientation, I noticed they avoided mentioning certain areas of the hospital, especially the deactivated wards, but I didn't think much of it at the time. As the night progressed, and I began to familiarize myself with the environment, the feeling of discomfort only grew. The hospital, with its old structure and nearly empty corridors, exuded a heavy atmosphere. In moments of silence, I could swear I heard strange noises, like distant footsteps or the sound of something scratching the walls. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, a result of fatigue in the unfamiliar environment. My night shift required me to do periodic rounds through the corridors, checking on patients and ensuring everything was in order. During these rounds, the discomfort intensified. The corridors seemed longer and darker, and the feeling of being watched became increasingly hard to ignore. Even with the hospital nearly empty, I felt as if something was following me, lurking in the shadows. When it was time for another round that night, I decided to ignore the strange sensations and focus on my tasks. I knew it was my first day, and I didn't want to let initial impressions affect me. However, as I headed to check the last few rooms, a chill ran down my spine. Something was wrong, but I didn't yet know what it was. Trying to stay calm, I continued my work, unaware that the night was about to become much more disturbing. While attending to one of the patients, an elderly man who had been hospitalized for a few weeks, I noticed he seemed more agitated than usual. I asked if something was wrong, and he looked at me with tired but concerned eyes. "I saw them again," he said in a whisper, his voice trembling slightly. "The people in white, they walk the corridors at night." His tone was serious, and the expression on his face sent a chill through me. I tried to reassure him, saying that no one other than the staff was in the hospital during the night, but his words left me uneasy. He insisted that he had seen these figures on previous nights, moving silently through the corridors, always at a distance, always out of reach. Although I tried to remain professional and keep calm, I couldn't help but think about what he had said. People in white? Who could they be? Even as I tried to ignore the comment, the patient's words stayed with me as I continued working. The idea that someone or something might be wandering through the hospital at night disturbed me more than I wanted to admit. The hospital already had a heavy atmosphere, and now, with this new information, my unease only grew. I tried to push these thoughts aside and focus on my tasks, but the feeling of discomfort was constant. As the night wore on, I became increasingly alert to any sound or movement around me. Every step I took through the corridors felt heavier, and the sensation of being watched grew stronger. Every shadow seemed to hide something, and every noise, no matter how small, made my heart race. I knew I needed to stay calm, but the patient's words kept echoing in my mind, fueling my fear. When I finished my tasks and prepared for another round, I decided I wouldn't let stories of dimly lit corridors affect me. After all, I was a professional, and I had a job to do. However, as I approached the deactivated wards, a new sound caught my attention. Voices. Low, indistinct voices, coming from where no one should be. I stopped and listened, trying to understand what was happening, but the voices only increased my unease. The voices continued, now clearer, though I couldn't make out the words. It was as if several people were talking at a distance, but the sound came from a deactivated ward where no one should be. Curiosity, mixed with a growing sense of fear, led me to follow the voices. I knew it was unwise, but something inside me pushed me to find out what was going on. I walked through the corridors, getting closer to the deactivated ward. The lighting was dim, and the lights flickered occasionally, creating shadows that moved on the walls. With each step, the air seemed colder, and the atmosphere around me became more oppressive. The voices continued, sometimes louder, sometimes softer, as if they were whispering secrets I shouldn't hear. My heart was racing, and I wondered if I should turn back. When I reached the entrance to the deactivated ward, I paused for a moment. The corridor ahead of me was completely dark, except for a single dim light at the far end. The voices seemed to emanate from the shadows, and I felt a chill run up my spine. Part of me wanted to turn around and return to the active ward, where I knew I was safe. But another part, the part that was still trying to be rational, told me I needed to investigate. With heavy breathing, I took my first steps into the deactivated ward. The sound of my shoes on the floor echoed through the empty corridor, and the voices seemed to grow more distant, as if they were moving away as I approached. The sensation of being watched increased with every second, but I kept going, trying to stay calm and focused. I was determined to find the source of those voices, even though fear told me to stop. As I advanced down the corridor, the dim light in front of me began to flicker. The air was cold, and the smell of mold and rust filled my nostrils. The deactivated ward seemed frozen in a forgotten time, a place where the past refused to die. I felt a presence, something I couldn't see but knew was there. The voices were now just whispers, almost imperceptible, and the silence became even more terrifying. I was alone, or at least, that's what I thought. As I moved deeper into the deactivated ward, the sense of unease only grew. Every step I took made the floor creak ominously, as if the hospital was protesting my presence there. The voices had gone silent, and the only sound remaining was the echo of my own footsteps. I passed by several closed doors, all with worn-out signs indicating that those rooms had been out of use for a long time. Finally, I reached an open room, lit only by the dim, flickering light of a ceiling lamp. The interior of the room was a reflection of a distant past: rusty gurneys, old medical equipment covered in dust, and patient files scattered on the floor. It was as if time had stopped there, and the hospital was trapped in a state of perpetual abandonment. The air was heavy, laden with a sense of sadness and despair. I looked around, trying to understand what had happened in that room. There was an oppressive silence, and the temperature seemed to have dropped even more. Every object there seemed to tell a story of pain and suffering, and I shuddered at the thought of the lives that had passed through that place. I approached one of the gurneys, running my hand over its rusty surface, feeling the rough and cold texture under my fingers. Something told me I shouldn't be there, but it was too late to turn back. Suddenly, the lights began to flicker violently, and I heard a sound that made me freeze in fear. It was the sound of something moving quickly through the corridors. I turned abruptly, trying to locate the source of the sound, but I only saw shadows darting across the walls, disappearing as quickly as they had appeared. My heart raced, and panic began to set in. I knew I needed to get out of there, but my legs felt glued to the floor. Trying to regain control, I started walking back toward the corridor, hoping to find the exit. The shadows continued to move around me, fast and silent, as if they were playing with me. Every time I turned, they vanished, leaving only the trace of an invisible presence. The fear was becoming unbearable, but I knew I needed to stay calm to get out of there. Something in that hospital was wrong, and I didn't want to find out what it was. Determined to leave that ward, I began to walk quickly towards the door that connected the deactivated ward to the active part of the hospital. My hands were trembling, and my heart was pounding uncontrollably as I tried to escape the shadows that seemed to be chasing me. Finally, I reached the door, and with a momentary sense of relief, grabbed the handle. But when I tried to turn it, it wouldn't budge. The door was locked. Panic overwhelmed me when I realized I was trapped in the oldest and darkest part of the hospital. I tried to force the door, pulling and pushing with all my strength, but it wouldn't give way. The sound of my efforts echoed through the empty corridors, and I was soon overcome by a sense of absolute despair. How could the door be locked? No one besides me was in that ward. It was as if the hospital had decided to keep me there, trapped inside its walls. Trying to control my fear, I began to think of other ways to get out. Maybe there was an emergency exit, a window I could use to escape. But every corridor I walked down seemed to lead me deeper into the hospital, further away from the safety of the active ward. With each step, the feeling of being watched intensified, and the silence around me was so dense that I could almost hear my own thoughts. As I walked through the corridors, The darkness seemed to close in around me, making everything even more claustrophobic. The hospital, which was already an uncomfortable place during the day, now seemed like a labyrinth of nightmares, where every corner hid something sinister. The temperature continued to drop, and I felt as if the air was getting heavier, making it harder to breathe. The shadows, which had once been mere vague shapes, now seemed to be coming to life. Desperate, I started calling for help, hoping that someone in the active ward could hear me. But my voice seemed to be swallowed by the darkness, without a response. I was completely alone, trapped in a place that seemed to be collapsing around me. Fear was taking over, and I knew I needed to find a way out of there before something worse happened. But every time I tried to find an exit, the hospital seemed to push me deeper into its darkness. As I continued my desperate search for a way out, the fear inside me grew with every moment. Every corridor seemed to lead nowhere, and the feeling of being followed became unbearable. With every step I heard sounds I couldn't explain. Footsteps that weren't mine, doors creaking in the distance, and indistinct whispers that seemed to come from all directions. I was terrified, but I knew I had to keep moving. The temperature in the hospital had dropped drastically, and I could see my breath forming small clouds of vapor in the icy air. The atmosphere around me was charged with a sense of oppression, as if the very walls of the hospital were closing in on me. I tried to stay calm, but the sound of footsteps that weren't mine echoing through the corridors pushed me to the brink of panic. I knew I wasn't alone, but I couldn't see who or what was with me. The whispers started to become clearer, and though I still couldn't understand the words, there was something about them that caused me deep fear. They didn't seem to come from a person, but from something that shouldn't exist. The sound was haunting, like voices from another world, calling me to a place I didn't want to go. I started running, trying to escape the sounds, but they seemed to follow me, always present, always closer. As I ran through the dark corridors, my mind was in turmoil. I tried to remember the way back to the active ward, but every corridor I walked down seemed identical to the last. It was as if the hospital was guiding me deeper into its darkness, away from any exit. Fear clouded my thoughts, and the only thing I could do was keep running, hoping to find a way out before it was too late. That's when I heard something that made my blood run cold. A voice, soft and whispering, started calling my name. At first I thought it was my imagination, but the voice continued, repeating my name in a low, threatening tone. Every time the voice whispered, I felt a chill run down my spine. The voice seemed to come from all sides, as if the entire hospital was calling me, drawing me towards something I couldn't see. With my heart racing and nerves on edge, I followed the voice that was whispering my name, even though I knew it was an irrational decision. There was something about the voice that was both terrifying and hypnotic, something that drew me in even against my will. With each step I took, the voice seemed to move, as if it was guiding me through a labyrinth I couldn't comprehend. I was lost, both physically and mentally, and the only thing I could do was follow the voice. The darkness around me seemed to grow even denser as I moved forward. The corridors, once wide and empty, now seemed narrow and oppressive, as if they were closing in on me. I was being led to a part of the hospital I had never seen before, an area where the lights didn't work, and the shadows seemed to have a life of their own. The voice continued to call me, always ahead, always out of reach. Finally, the voice stopped suddenly, leaving an absolute and terrifying silence. I was in a corridor I didn't recognize, where the walls seemed even older and more worn. The only light I had was from my flashlight, which cast a weak, flickering glow in the darkness. The feeling that something was about to happen was overwhelming, and I knew I was no longer in control of the situation. Something in that hospital was guiding me, and I didn't know where. As I looked around, trying to understand where I was, I noticed a door ahead of me, a door I had never noticed before. It was different from the others, older and more worn, as if it hadn't been opened in decades. The sense of fear was almost unbearable, but something pushed me to move forward, to find out what was beyond that door. With trembling hands, I grabbed the handle and, with tremendous effort, began to turn it. The door opened with a long, ominous creak, revealing a corridor even darker than the one before. The light from my flashlight seemed to be absorbed by the darkness, and the air was colder than ever. I took a hesitant step inside, feeling as though I was crossing a boundary that shouldn't be crossed. The feeling of being watched was stronger than ever, and I knew that by entering that corridor, something inside me would change forever. With my heart pounding and terror consuming me, I knew I needed to get out of there before fear completely overwhelmed me. Every step I took in that dark corridor seemed to pull me deeper into a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The voice that had been whispering my name now became a distant echo, mingling with my own thoughts. I felt like I was on the brink of losing my sanity, but one last spark of strength pushed me forward, desperate to find a way out. As I moved forward, something inside me shifted. The darkness that had seemed suffocating began to dissipate, and in the distance I glimpsed a faint glow, a dim light that suggested a way back to reality. I didn't know if I could trust my vision, but it was the only hope I had. With hesitant steps, I followed the light, which seemed closer and closer, guiding me back to where I wanted to be. The voice that had once terrified me began to fade, as if something was allowing me to escape. Finally, the light ahead of me intensified, revealing the end of the corridor and with it, a door with a sliver of light shining from underneath it. Without hesitation, I ran towards it, my body trembling with fear and exhaustion. When I reached the door, I turned the handle with all the strength I had left, and to my surprise, it opened easily. As I passed through the door, I was enveloped by a sense of relief so intense that I nearly collapsed. I was back in the active ward of the hospital, surrounded by the familiar lights and comforting sounds of the place. For a moment I stood still, trying to catch my breath and process what had just happened. Everything seemed so normal, as if nothing I had experienced had been real. I looked around, still dazed, and that's when I saw the elderly patient, the one who had warned me about the people in white. He was standing outside his room, looking at me with a serene expression, as if he knew exactly what I had been through. I walked towards him, still speechless, and before I could say anything, he spoke calmly. "I told you they were there. They're always there. But not everyone can come back." His words, spoken with an eerie calm, sent a shiver through me. There was nothing more to be said, and he just looked at me, as if he knew I needed time to understand everything that had happened. With my legs still trembling, I walked slowly to the nurse's station, trying to gather my thoughts. The hospital was back to its normal state, as if the previous night had never happened. The shadows, the voices, everything had disappeared. But the patient's words continued to echo in my mind, a reminder that what I experienced that night was beyond understanding and perhaps beyond the reality I knew. My first night shift began with a mix of curiosity and apprehension, unaware that this night would change my life forever. I accepted the job at an isolated gas station located on a road cutting through a vast forest. I knew it would be a solitary job, but the idea of spending the night in such a remote place didn't seem so daunting during the day. However, when the sun set, darkness enveloped the station like a shroud, and the forest surrounding it became an oppressive and imposing presence. With few tasks to do, I spent the first few minutes familiarizing myself with the environment. The station was small, consisting of a convenience store, 2 gas pumps, and a small office in the back. The night started quietly, with only a few occasional customers stopping to refuel before disappearing into the darkness of the road. The solitude of the place began to intensify as time passed, and the absolute silence became almost suffocating. The store was lit by fluorescent lights that emitted a low hum, and the sound of the refrigerators echoed through the empty space. I tried to distract myself by organizing the shelves and checking the stock, but I couldn't ignore the growing sense of isolation. The forest around me seemed to be closing in, as if it were surrounding the station. The wind blowing through the trees made noises that sounded like distant whispers, causing my heart to race from time to time. As the night wore on, I began to feel increasingly uneasy. The few cars that appeared brought momentary relief, but they soon vanished, leaving me alone once again. With each passing hour, the silence became more oppressive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The forest around me seemed to be watching, waiting, and this made me increasingly nervous. As the clock approached 3 in the morning, I began to feel the weight of fatigue. My mind drifted between reality and the disturbing images evoked by the darkness. I tried to focus on simple tasks, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me alone. The silence, which at first seemed like harmless company, now transformed into a threatening presence, and I knew I needed to stay alert. Around 3 a.m, when the silence had become unbearable, I heard the sound of an approaching engine. At first, I felt relieved, thinking that I would finally have some company, even if only for a few minutes. I approached the window to look out, but what I saw made me hesitate. An old, worn-out, and poorly maintained car slowly pulled up next to one of the gas pumps. The vehicle seemed out of place, as if it belonged to another era. I waited for the driver to get out, but he made no move to open the door. Through the dirty glass, I could see a shadowy figure sitting behind the wheel, but I couldn't make out their face. The engine remained running, and the headlights were pointed directly at the store, illuminating it in a way that made me uncomfortable. It was as if the car was watching me, as if the vehicle itself had unknown intentions. I tried to convince myself that nothing was wrong. Maybe the driver was just checking something before getting out, or perhaps he was tired and needed a few minutes to compose himself. Even so, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was strange. The fact that he remained inside the car without making any movement made me uneasy. The headlights remained fixed on the store, illuminating me as I tried to continue with my tasks. With each passing minute, my anxiety grew. The car seemed like a sinister presence, and the driver, a mystery I couldn't unravel. I began to question whether I should go out and offer help, but the idea of approaching that vehicle gave me chills. I looked at the clock, hoping that time would pass quickly, but the minutes seemed to drag on. The silence of the station, combined with the constant hum of the engine, created a suffocating atmosphere. Finally, I decided that I couldn't keep ignoring the car. Something needed to be done, but my instincts told me to be cautious. I made a decision. If the driver didn't get out of the car in a few more minutes, I would go out to check if something was wrong. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves, and prepared myself for whatever was about to happen. But deep down, I hoped he would simply start the car and drive away, leaving me in peace to finish my shift. After waiting a few minutes without the driver making any move, I decided I couldn't delay the situation any longer. With my heart racing, I grabbed the store keys and walked toward the door. Each step felt heavier than the last, and the sense of discomfort intensified. When I finally stepped out of the store, the cold air of the early morning hit me, heightening the sense of isolation. The car remained stationary, with the engine running and the blinding headlights on. As I approached, I noticed that the car's windows were slightly fogged, making it even harder to see inside. I tried to peer through the glass, but all I could make out was the silhouette of an unmoving figure behind the wheel. I approached slowly, trying to appear calm, but my heart was pounding uncontrollably. When I reached the side of the car, I looked inside and felt a shiver run down my spine. The doors were slightly ajar, and the keys remained in the ignition, but the driver had disappeared. The seat was empty, with no sign that anyone had been there just minutes before. The engine was still quietly running, and the car's interior was cold, as if it had been abandoned a long time ago. A sense of panic began to form inside me, and I quickly turned around, looking for the driver nearby. But there was no one. The road was deserted, and the forest around me seemed like an impenetrable wall of darkness. The only light came from the car's headlights, which now seemed even more sinister. The terror I felt at seeing the empty vehicle was immediate, and I knew I needed to get out of there. Without thinking twice, I ran back to the store, locking the door behind me with trembling hands. The silence inside the store was almost deafening, and the sound of my own heartbeat seemed to echo through the empty space. I returned to the counter, trying to process what had just happened. My mind was in a whirlwind of unanswered questions. Who was the driver? Where had he gone? And why had he left the car running, with the doors open? None of it made sense, and the feeling that something was very wrong overwhelmed me. I knew I couldn't just stand there, but fear was paralyzing me. Whatever was happening, I was alone to face it. After a few minutes of trying to calm my nerves, I decided to check the security cameras. Maybe they could provide some clue as to what was going on. I walked over to the monitor, my hands still shaking, and started reviewing the recordings from the past few hours. At first, everything seemed normal. The few customers who had passed through the station, the silence of the empty gas pumps, the darkness of the road. But then, something caught my attention. On one of the screens, I saw a male figure walking around the station. The image was grainy and not very clear, but I could clearly see the silhouette of a man moving slowly through the pump area. He seemed to be inspecting the place, but what scared me the most was the fact that he occasionally stopped to look directly at the cameras as if he knew he was being watched. The sense of panic returned with full force, and a wave of terror swept over me. I ran to the store window and looked outside, hoping to see someone, but all I saw was the darkness of the night and the glow of the car's headlights still parked there. There was no sign of any person. The station seemed empty and silent, but the images on the cameras didn't lie. Someone had been there, walking around, and now he had disappeared without a trace. What did he want? And where was he now? The questions multiplied in my mind, and I couldn't find any answers. I returned to the monitor and continued watching the recordings, searching for any indication of where the man had gone. But at a certain point, he simply vanished from the images. A sense of helplessness washed over me. There was no way to know if he was still around, hiding somewhere in the shadows. The only thing I knew was that I was no longer alone, and that realization was terrifying. I turned off the monitor and tried to think of what to do. Each passing minute felt like an added weight on my shoulders. The fear that the man might be watching me, waiting for the right moment to act, paralyzed me. The store, which had once seemed like a safe refuge, now felt like a trap. I knew I needed to make a decision, but fear was consuming me. All I could do was hope that the situation wouldn't get worse. As I tried to decide what to do, the sound of rain began to pound on the store's roof. At first, it was a relief to hear something break the oppressive silence of the night, but I quickly realized that the storm would make everything even scarier. The raindrops beat hard against the windows, and the darkness outside seemed to become even more impenetrable. The rain turned the forest around me into a wall of shadows that seemed to close in on the station. The tension inside the store increased. With each beat of the rain, I felt more isolated, as if the outside world was slowly being erased. I tried to convince myself that I was safe inside the store, that nothing could harm me there, but the feeling of insecurity was constant. I looked at the monitor again, but saw nothing new. The man had disappeared, but the fear that he might return kept me on edge. Then I heard something that made me freeze in fear. Soft tapping began to echo against the store's windows, interspersed with the sound of the rain. At first I thought it might just be the wind, but the tapping was rhythmic, as if someone was trying to get my attention. I looked at the windows, but saw no one outside. The store's lights reflected in the darkness, creating distorted shadows that seemed to move with each flicker. The feeling of being watched returned with full force. I knew that something or someone was out there, but I couldn't see anything beyond the darkness and the rain. Each tap made my heart race, and the fear that the man from the cameras was trying to get in became unbearable. Each second seemed to stretch into eternity, and I felt more and more trapped, unsure of where to run or how to protect myself. The tapping continued for a few more minutes before abruptly stopping, leaving an even more unsettling silence. The store felt like a cocoon of fear and uncertainty, and I knew I couldn't just sit there waiting for something worse to happen. I needed to do something, but what? The rain, which should have been just a natural event, had turned into an element of terror, making me feel even more vulnerable and isolated. And the night was far from over. Determined not to just sit and wait, I decided to take a walk around the store and check every window and door. Maybe I was overreacting, but I needed to be sure everything was locked and secure. I grabbed the flashlight we kept under the counter and started inspecting every corner of the store, trying to keep the panic under control. The sound of the rain, combined with the echo of my own footsteps, created a claustrophobic sensation. I walked slowly, shining the flashlight on each window, but all I saw was the reflection of the store's interior. The world outside was obscured by the storm, and the thought that something might be hiding in the shadows terrified me. Each window seemed like an entryway to the unknown, and every imagined tap made me shudder. I tried to convince myself that I was safe, but the fear was stronger than reason. When I returned to the counter, something on the camera monitor caught my attention. The images were distorted, as if the rain was interfering with the signals. My breathing grew heavier as I watched the screens, trying to understand what was happening. Suddenly, the figure of the man appeared again, this time much closer to the store. He seemed to move with purpose, heading toward the main entrance. My heart raced and panic overtook me. I ran to the front door, my hands trembling as I tried to turn the key in the lock. The sound of the rain mixed with the sound of my own desperation, creating a cacophony inside my mind. Finally, I managed to lock the door, but the relief was short-lived. I knew that a simple glass door wouldn't be enough to stop someone who really wanted to get in. I backed away, trying to think of what to do next. But my brain was in a state of shock. The monitor continued to flicker, and the figure of the man was now standing outside, looking directly at the camera with a smile that sent shivers down my spine. He seemed to know that I was watching, and the fact that he didn't try to hide his intentions made me even more terrified. It was as if he was playing with me, testing my limits. I was cornered, unsure of how to react or how to escape the situation. The sound of the tapping on the window stopped abruptly, plunging the store into an oppressive silence. The only sound remaining was that of the rain beating on the roof, but even that seemed distant, muffled by the fear that gripped me. I looked at the monitor again and saw the man standing right in front of the store's door, staring directly at the camera with a disturbing smile. The way he watched me, as if savoring my fear, made my stomach turn. I knew I needed to do something, but the terror paralyzed me. He wasn't trying to force his way in, which left me even more confused and scared. What did he want? Why was he just standing there watching me? Each second seemed to stretch into eternity, and the tension was almost unbearable. My mind raced in circles, trying to find a solution, but the fear was a barrier preventing me from thinking clearly. Taking a deep breath, I forced myself to act. I knew I couldn't stay there in plain sight, defenseless. I needed to find a safe place where I could hide and think of a plan. My hands were still trembling as I slowly backed away from the door, keeping my eyes fixed on the monitor. The man didn't move, just continued to smile, and that filled me with dread. It was as if he knew exactly what I was doing and was waiting for it. Finally, I decided to run to the back of the store where the stockroom was. The space was small, but it had a door I could lock and I would be out of sight there. I passed the shelves of products, trying not to make any noise, but every small sound seemed to echo through the empty space. When I finally reached the stockroom door, I quickly entered and closed it behind me, locking it with trembling hands. The silence inside was even more oppressive. Sitting on the stockroom floor, with my back against the door, I heard the sound of something tapping on the store's glass entrance. I knew it was him, trying to find me, but I was hidden, out of his immediate reach. With the phone out of service and the internet down, there was no way to call for help. All I could do was wait and hope that he would give up and leave. But deep down, I knew the night was far from over. Trapped in the stockroom, fear began to give way to despair. I knew I couldn't stay hidden there forever, but the thought of going out and facing the unknown outside terrified me. The rain continued to pound on the roof, every sound amplified in the oppressive silence of the small space. My hands trembled, and my mind raced in circles, trying to find a solution, but everything seemed useless. I was completely cut off, with no cell signal and no internet. The isolation was total. As I desperately tried to think of something, I heard the tapping on the store's glass intensify. Each tap was a reminder that I was being hunted, that there was something or someone out there trying to get in. The taps were soft but rhythmic, as if he was waiting for me to make a mistake, to come out of my hiding place. I looked around, searching for something I could use to defend myself, but the stockroom was full of only harmless products and empty boxes. The feeling of being completely vulnerable was overwhelming. I returned to the stockroom door, trying to listen for anything beyond the taps and the rain, but the store seemed suspended in terrifying silence. I decided to take a peek at the camera monitor, hoping for a better view of what was happening. With my heart in my throat, I unlocked the door and opened it just enough to peek into the hallway. Slowly, I made my way back to the counter, always alert for any sound or movement. When I reached the monitor, fear took hold of me. The figure of the man was standing at the store's door, his face partially illuminated by the car's headlights still on outside. He was closer now, his eyes fixed on the camera, and a disturbing smile was forming on his lips. He began tapping lightly on the glass, as if testing its strength, trying to see how much longer I could hold out. The sound of the taps echoed in my mind, and the terror that he might enter at any moment paralyzed me. Suddenly, the glass door shattered with a crash, scattering shards across the floor. My heart nearly stopped, and I felt a scream caught in my throat. He was about to enter, and I knew I had nowhere to run. At that moment, when everything seemed lost, I heard the sound of a loud horn coming from outside. The noise was deafening, like a siren cutting through the night. I ran to the window and saw the lights of a truck that had just pulled into the station. The truck driver, realizing the situation, kept honking, and the man who was trying to break into the store stopped abruptly. He looked at the truck, and for a moment our eyes met on the monitor. The smile disappeared from his face, replaced by an expression of anger. Without hesitation, he turned and ran toward the car he had left running, quickly got in, and sped off into the darkness of the road, disappearing into the night. I could hardly believe what had just happened. My breathing was heavy, and my legs barely held me up. The truck driver got out of his vehicle and ran to the store, asking if I was okay. Trembling, I thanked him for arriving in time, still unable to fully process what I had just experienced. The police were called, and they arrived shortly after, but the man had already disappeared. Though I was physically safe, I knew the memory of that night would stay with me forever. Every knock on the door, every sound of rain, would be a reminder of what could have happened. But at least, that night, the nightmare had ended.